IVM.
Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast by the Takshashila Institution. We are a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like bringing fresh perspectives to Indian affairs and Indian perspectives to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat.
Hello and welcome to All Things Policy. On this second day of our All Things Policy New Year, we'd like to talk a little bit about policy careers. Since yesterday we had Jairam Ramesh with us telling us about how a bunch of smart Indians really transformed the country in the 1930s and 1940s. We thought it would be a great time to talk about how you can actually get on board with us and work together to change the country today. And I think that this is really, considering the state of the country today, really the perfect time to talk about it. So with me, I have a bunch of folks from our policy school. I have with us Apurva, our program manager. I have Shibani, policy analyst, who also does kind of everything. And of course, Sowmya, who heads our corporate engagement. So what we're going to be talking about today is how exactly careers in public policy work, what kind of backgrounds people come from when they enter the space, the kind of things they hope to achieve, and the kind of work we actually do. So let's begin with you, Sowmya. So can you tell us a bit about how exactly you decided to get into the space? What's your career trajectory been like?
Okay, so I wouldn't say there's a direct linkage with my academic background to what's happening now in terms of my career. But I was just curious about public policy overall. I think it was just an area of interest for that matter. But having been in the corporate and I was doing an HR role, there were instances when I fundamentally thought about, getting into the development sector also because of my master's in social work background. So while in the corporate, I was engaged with a lot of CSR activities, and that kind of led into a lot of it saying, okay, this is probably the place I need to be, and slowly transitioned into the development sector. And I was working with an organization, a tech organization, which was trying to solve credit problems.
So how exactly did that move happen? You said that you decided you wanted to be in a different space, right? So was it because of your intellectual interests or because of a broader social sort of obligation that you felt that you had to uphold?
In fact, both. So I said, okay, corporate career was going really well, but that was probably not satisfying enough. And I was always looking out for opportunities. So I picked up some more courses in the process, but nothing stabilized in that sense. Then I said, okay, it's okay to take, after 10 years of corporate experience, to move into the development sector. And that was great for me because I got to do a lot of grassroots level work. I interacted with a lot of women entrepreneurs, a lot of financial literacy happened through that. The kind of impression and the impact that it left on, beneficiaries was something that gave me the courage to think about saying, okay, there's more to it. And while we kind of change lives of women in specific communities and geographies, the question that always was around how do you scale it, how do you make it a macro level impact? And for me, I thought policy could be a solution, but I didn't know enough. And that was the time I was already looking at courses, and I had narrowed in on Takshashila to do my public policy course. And I was again deciding whether it should be a postgraduate program or a graduate certificate program. But I had already heard about the rigor and everything that goes into the course. More so for me, the frameworks that were taught in the course and the analytical components of it was interesting because that was never part of my academics. So taking that to solve, problems was what was exciting for me. And we worked on the universal basic income as one of the things for our last assignments. And that was something that gave a lot of insight to the data that we had. And while the government was contemplating at that time whether to do it or not, for me, I felt we had an edge because it was still in the talks, but we were already trying to grapple with data there. So that was interesting. And with the nonprofit corporate kind of experience, I said this fits well for my next career trajectory. Did the course, and then, of course, I came on board to head corporate affairs at Takshashila.
So quite a story. So we'll come back to what your role is here in a little bit, right? So I think, Apurva, you had kind of a similar trajectory. You worked in corporate for quite a while, but the reasons for you actually getting into the space are kind of different. So can you tell us a bit about that?
Okay, so Anirudh, I was happily doing my engineering in 2007.
Oh, I was very unhappy doing it.
Okay. So in my second year, somewhere around 2009, I realized that I had an academic bent of mind, and I started liking humanities and liberal arts a lot more than my engineering textbooks. And then I decided that I won't be able to continue with the engineering and the tech sector, and I thought that I should sort of move to a sector that has more impact to the society rather than doing an engineering thing. And I couldn't visualize myself sitting in a cubicle and solving some problems for a distant client. So after completing my engineering, I spent 2 years in IT sector. But by that time, I decided that I would sort of make this transition. In 2003, I did my master's in development studies from Azim Premji University. And I think those 2 years were the best days of my life, if I may borrow Bryan Adams' lines.
Because I just remember he's saying that working here is not the best days of his life.
I know. I need to have a conversation with you.
So it opened a whole new universe for me, because the structure, the curriculum of development studies in this university is more practitioner oriented rather than theory based. And I got opportunity to work in the boondocks of rural India. I worked in so over the past 5-6 years after passing from university, I have worked in 7 or 8 states across all sectors in healthcare, education, disability sector, skilling, and adolescent health. So while working as a practitioner, I realized that I may have some framework and concepts, but those frameworks and concepts are not enough. So while working with the government of Rajasthan, I realized that that personally I don't have that expertise to solve some of the major policy issues. So at that point of time, I thought that I should move to an organization which will give me a 360-degree view of the entire development sector. Because at that point of time, I realized that I have developed blinkers around my eyes, because it was all about public health, it was all about NRHM, it was all about ANCs and PNCs. So I moved to a capacity building consultancy firm in which I was anchoring a leadership program, and that helped me sort of sink into the development sector. So I got an opportunity to interact with the development sector organizations, large, medium-sized and small organizations, with donors, with funders, and with government officials. It was at that point of time I deliberately sort of made a move to policy thing, because working in a CSR, working in health sector, working in a capacity building sector, I realized that I've still not been able to develop those concepts and those principles, and that those frameworks are still missing. So at that point of time, I made a decision that I should work with an organization that is working with policy, and especially in social development policy, because that's my forte and that's my area of interest, and here I am.
I find it interesting that both you and Sowmya were both interested in learning about frameworks, learning about concepts, and that is what brought you to work at Takshashila. Interesting, but Shibani here would have a completely different take, because you actually studied this for your masters, right? So can you tell us a bit about how you ended up here, and how it seems like it would be quite different from this story, right?
So I was a very idealistic teenager who knew at the age of 16 that she wanted a career in public service, and at that time it meant joining the civil services. So all my decisions of doing history and economics in school, then graduating in economics from college, everything was around that dream of joining the Indian civil service. But it was also during this time that I pushed myself into a lot of internships to get an exposure in terms of what is happening outside of the government. So I interned with a lot of NGOs across the city. I worked in education, did work with people with disabilities and try and see how we can how policy can help them. And I also worked in urban planning. So it was just my way of figuring out what exactly I wanted to pursue. So during one of these internships, I also worked with the Ministry of External Affairs on a research project. And that experience taught me the value of being outside the bureaucracy and still being able or being in a position to influence policy decisions. that gave me a lot more satisfaction personally, and I thought I could contribute more in that space than I could as a bureaucrat. So I think that was the decision point for me, where I decided I didn't want to, that I could do a lot more keeping that dream of public service alive, but not necessarily as a civil servant.
So can you tell us a bit about how that kind of bleeds into your work here? Because you've actually consulted and worked on projects that should ideally, let's hope, influence government policy, right?
Right. So what I'm doing right now gives me a lot of satisfaction, and I know it's making an impact. Even if it's a small dent, I'm happy to be doing even just that, because I realized a lot of conversations about politics and policy were limited to my circles. So people that I went to college with, people who were with me in my master's class, or just my friends. A lot of people on the periphery of my social circle could not see the intended and unintended consequences of certain policies. They were curious for sure, but maybe they didn't have the time to sort of get into it. And I think that is what I enjoy doing now, is making policy understandable for people to then make their own decisions about what is good policy and what isn't.
You had a really interesting piece out recently about Kailasha and national recognition.
Yeah, so I mean, that was for fun, but I like that you can communicate, you can break down ideas, because a lot of people consume news, and what we understand of policy is often based on political rhetoric or what you hear from your neighbor or your WhatsApp group and stuff like that. If someone can simplify things and be objective and tell you this is how things are going to affect you, yet not make the decision for you about whether it's right or wrong, good or bad, I think it adds a lot of value to public opinion, to the narrative around any policy.
So you see your role basically as helping people better understand the complexities of the policy space.
Also break down this myth that it's policy is for the corridors of, Raisina Hill. It's not. It's for the people.
Yes.
And you should understand it. You have elected representatives who are making decisions that should benefit you ultimately.
Okay, so let's move the conversation to you, Sowmya. So while Shibani is in more of a public-facing role when she's talking to the public through op-eds and helping break all this down, you kind of lead the charge in another area, right? Specifically engaging with corporates and so on and so forth. So you can tell us a bit about how that works, and more importantly, how that kind of bleeds into your overall career trajectory. Because while Shibani made the excellent point that very often policy is thought of as something that only happens in Raisina Hill, so you have to have 3 or 4 master's degrees and maybe 5 or 6 PhDs to actually talk about it. That doesn't necessarily have to be the case, and you can actually understand, engage with policy no matter who you are and what your background is. How could this be useful to somebody who is in the middle of their career, who isn't interested in going back to school again? How can they get enrolled in this space? How does it work for them?
Okay, I have a couple of points here. So one, I think for a lot of people, just to think about having a career in public policy, they look at universities outside of India, or they're looking at courses that will mean you need to kind of put a full stop in your life and, take a full-time course and all of that. For me, I think one interesting thing about Takshashila course itself, when I decided to do and before I joined here, was the fact that it was online and definitely flexible in terms of tuning into webinars in case I missed one, and also having it comfortable for working professionals because it's weekend webinars. If it was not for this structure, I doubt I would have been able to take it up, because I was not in a frame of mind where I will put something on a pause, because I was already working. And then I said, I'm intrigued by this, but will I want to dedicate 2 years of my life and pick up something, I wouldn't do that trade-off at all. So the way I navigated through it itself was the fact that the offering of it was very unconventional. If it was a pure academic structured course, maybe that, I wouldn't even think about it. So the structure helped me kind of think through the course, first of all. Secondly, while I interact with a lot of corporate professionals and people who are just interested but not necessarily thinking of a career shift, I see that they don't mind kind of retaining their profile in whichever organization they are, right? They could be associated with non-profits or corporates, or they're with the media and doing communications role. So I help them kind of understand the program better, and there are a lot of instances when we have customized the program for certain requirements in the corporate. So that's also interesting, because a media company would want to know about how the discourse should be, or look at how the narratives are arriving, and just the fact that how do you put out stuff, you look at it with data rather than having a very newsy kind of tone to it, right? So that's for me interesting, because I understand what the corporate needs and what we offer, and we tie the two together to also meet the flexible requirements that corporate would have, that I only can spare the leadership team for 2 days, so we do that. So that ties in well into my corporate career of HR role that I played, because the learning and development teams need to understand that it's not always technical training that's going to scale up the organization, right? As a business, you're interested in what's happening in those geographies where you interact with, or how your business is going to play a role, especially on the economic side of things. So sometimes I think people fail to understand that, and that's how, while Shibani says, you kind of alienate policy and say that's meant for few people and especially the elite. I would say it's just the other way around. Whether we like it or not, we are all part of it. Right, that's one. Other thing that I do here is partnerships. So I interact with different entities who would like to kind of collaborate, and we do different things. It could be roundtable conversations sometimes on a specific topic on research that we are doing, or at times it could be author discussions that we have here. So we are trying to also curate people who are invested and interested in the research areas that we work on, as well as tie them up to networks where they could thrive on other research areas which we probably don't do, but they are interested in. So I think the alumni network engagement is also something that is exciting, and for me interesting to see how people who take up our courses are able to apply a lot of what is being taught in the program at different positions that they are in. So I think just the fact that the course is accessible to people and can be taken on a flexible note, and just having interactions with multiple stakeholders is my role, and it thrives into giving a better perspective of what public policy means.
I think it's pretty cool that basically public policy has been kind of almost a natural transition in your career trajectory. It hasn't required you to particularly change your career plans in any major way.
Absolutely.
You've been applying the same skills that you've been building up over all these years in a slightly different space, but essentially achieving something that you think makes more of an impact, which is pretty cool.
Just adding to one of the things that Sowmya said, so in my interaction with students, I've met people who say that we're not looking to actively switch jobs and move into a different industry from the one that we're currently in, but we just want to learn a little bit more. And I think the programs that Takshashila runs, at the very sort of elementary level, even if you don't, change jobs or do something very radical after you finish the program, you will be a more informed citizen. You will know how to cut through the bullshit, and you will have a better understanding of what's happening around you and how it's going to impact you. And I think just being able to achieve that itself is a great thing.
So, Anirudh, just to add to what Shibani spoke a short while ago, that it's a misconception that policy happens at the corridors of power. I think it's some myth. Policy design might happen at the corridors of power, but the implementation of the very same policy happens at the grassroots level. And there's a whole cadre of people and professionals who help them implement these policies. And it's this particular cadre that sort of bridges the last mile delivery problem. I see Takshashila course as a capacity building thing for our students to bridge this particular gap, because the courses are teaching frameworks, concepts and principles of public policy analysis that will help them implement these policies in a more effective way.
Okay, thank you guys so much. So I'm sure that our loyal listeners would have heard 30-second ads for each of our courses in the beginning of every episode up till this point. So thank you guys for listening to this entire 20-minute advertisement for our courses. We'd absolutely love to hear from you. If you'd like to study with us, if you'd like to work with us, absolutely get in touch. We'll put our email IDs and our Twitter handles in the episode description. So thank you so much for joining us, and thank you so much for listening to All Things Policy.
If you liked our show, don't forget to check out other interesting podcasts on the IVM network. You can tune into them on the IVM Podcast app, ivmpodcast.com, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. You can also follow IVM on social media. The handle is @IVM Podcasts on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. And hey, if you'd like to dive into Takshashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs, check us out at our Twitter handle @Takshashila INST. or our website, takshashila.org.in.
I hope you enjoyed that show. We'd like to thank our sponsors this week, Intel, Storytel, and Cambly. This week, in the spirit of Christmas, instead of giving you the long, drawn-out promo that I normally do, all I'm going to do is ask you to give me a Christmas gift. Go to ivmpodcast.com/survey, fill out our survey, and send it out to us. We'd really appreciate it. Thank you so much for listening to the IVM Podcast Network this year in 2019.
Hey guys, this is me, Eva Bhatt, your host for the podcast 9XM Soundcast. This podcast is produced by India's largest music network, 9X Media. We have been catering music and you have been enjoying. And now we bring you a podcast where music inspires. Every week, I interact with some of the best minds from the music industry to understand their creative discipline. Every new episode will feature artists who will share inspiring notes from their journey, some valuable tips for budding artists. So do subscribe to the podcast where music inspires. Enjoy a brand new episode of 9XM Soundcast every Tuesday on IVM Podcast app or website or wherever you get your podcast from.